Good morning. Today, Pastor Rob Daniels will share the message from two passages. One from the Old Testament in the book of Numbers, chapter 14, verses 1 through 4, and one from the New Testament from the book of Acts, chapter 8, verses 1 through 3. I will read the first passage, and Aaliyah will read the second passage. Hear the word of the Lord. That night, all the members of the community raised their voices and wept aloud. All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, "If only we had died in Egypt or in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt?" And they said to each other, "We should choose a leader and go back to Egypt."
On that day, a great persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. Godly men buried Stephen and mourned deeply for him, but Saul began to destroy the church. Going from house to house, he dragged off both men and women and put them in prison.
This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. I want to share a picture with you. This is the house that I grew up in, and it's in Queens. And as a little kid, I recall one year when our home in Queens was robbed. I couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old, and I clearly recall finding out that my brand new Christmas present, get this, it was a portable black and white television. So that should tell you something. A portable black and white television was among the items that was taken from our home. I was devastated. Almost as devastated when I found out that in New York City, because it's so big, probably, Santa sometimes has helpers to make gifts possible, because I noticed that my TV had the name of a local department store stamped on the bottom of it. But when I found that the TV was gone, I think I cried. And if you knew me as a kid, that was kind of my signature move, to cry about everything. At any rate, I remember after that robbery, things changed around our house. I recall adding more and new locks to doors. We always made sure that if we went out, windows were closed and doors were locked. We had a door on that picture. Lala, put that back up for a second if you can. We had a door that if you look where the car is, the little silver car in the driveway, there's a door in that driveway that's halfway between the main floor and the basement. And we had a door that led out to that driveway. And as I spoke about this memory with my mom last week, she confirmed that we had to get a new door. The old door had glass panes in it. And in her words, that was back in the day when you could have glass panes in the door and mistakenly think that no one would break in to do what they did. And this new updated replacement door had no glass. It was simply one solid, heavy-duty, reinforced, dead-bolted door. As for me, and there are many folks here who could probably identify, I was never the same. My sense of complete security had been changed like it had never been before. Someone had broken in and messed up things in my little life. There was no going back to the way things had been before. We had to make a new normal. It was a challenge, a necessity, but frankly, it was also an opportunity to do things differently. And can I share with you what I think in some ways, not completely, but in many ways reminds me of the break-in on that little house? COVID. Because see, COVID's been similar. It broke into our lives, has caused incredible disruption, immeasurable pain, wreckage, everything, life, death. in our economic system, our politics. It's impacted us through the recognition of racial inequities that maybe we've never seen before. Everything busted and broken up like my house when I was a little kid. And as I reflect on that, and a frequent refrain that I have heard over the last few months, I'm sure some of you have probably heard it as well. As a matter of fact, I'll invite you to finish this little sentence with me, if you will. Here's the sentence. I can't blank for things to get blank to blank, right? You know what let's do that together. I can't wait for things to get to normal. Has anybody heard that? Anybody heard that? Y'all want to admit that? Maybe you've said it. I mean, I think maybe I've even said it. You know, I'm really grateful for Pastor Anna's message last week when she talked about the sustenance, the sustaining power of God. And over the last several weeks, Pastor Peter challenged us to think about the church, especially since we've really, over the last year, been the church apart from one another due to COVID. What that means, why it matters. What are the implications as we begin to think about what it might look like to be the church again? What would it look like when we start talking about coming back together? What might reconnecting with one another entail? What will it cost? Why we may have to think about going back to normal not being a realistic expectation. Or better yet, why we might want to avoid going back to normal altogether. And instead engage in a wholesale renovation of what used to be so that what emerges from the normal we used to know is an entirely new normal. And here's the reality. Here's the reality that as a staff, we have found ourselves thinking about over the last number of weeks. And this lingering impact of COVID on our being the church. What's the answer? Does it involve, do we have to work harder? Do we have to work smarter? Should we do more? Should we do less? Do we just give up? But there are two deeply disruptive accounts from Scripture that I think are particularly relevant to what I want to share today. The first comes from the book of Numbers. Numbers chapter 14, verses 1 through 4. And the second comes from the New Testament, book of Acts, chapter 8, verses 1 through 3. First, I want us to look at Numbers. And in that Numbers passage, here's what we find out. The brilliant idea in the Numbers passage is, let's go back to Egypt. Let's go back to Egypt. Perhaps you're familiar with this account from the Old Testament. After over 400 years of enslavement, the descendants of the patriarch Jacob, who's also known as Israel, they're freed by God and led out of slavery with Moses with great joy and anticipation of returning to the land that had been promised to their ancestor, the patriarch Abraham. However, in the book of Numbers, the children of Jacob, now known as the nation of Israel, discover that the journey to the promised land, it's pretty difficult. The people become rebellious and quarrelsome with Moses and with God. As well, they complain about all sorts of things. There's no meat out here, there's no fresh produce out here, there's no bread out here. And ultimately, as we continue to read, the nation of Israel suggests the most ridiculous suggestion you could imagine. We'll just go back to Egypt. Read with me again. Look at this. That night, all the members of the community raised their voices and wept aloud. All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, "If only we had died in Egypt or in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? And they said to each other, we should choose a leader and go back to Egypt. How ridiculous is that? Does anybody remember what they were in Egypt? Anybody remember in Egypt? What were they? They were slaves. And in the face of hardship and difficulty, in their journey to freedom, they want to return to a way of life that was in every conceivable way awful. Ekemini Iwan is a public theologian. She's also co-host of Truth Table podcast with Dr. Christina Edmondson and Michelle Higgins. And in a recent article for the Atlantic magazine, she wrote a piece called "We Could Have Changed the World." This is where she makes an argument that the upheaval of the pandemic was an opportunity to imagine a better world, a better society, she says. Instead, we're rushing back to normal. She wrote this. She said, as Americans sheltered in place, rattled by the changes, many pointed out a small sliver of hope that embedded within this crisis was an opportunity to remake the world so that when we re-entered society, it would be better than how we left it. She says this, in the US now, restrictions are mostly lifted, vaccines are available, disinfectants are abundant, and there's toilet paper on store shelves. But the inequities that predated the pandemic remain unattended to. What is obscured by all the excitement is two realities that we ignore at our peril. One is that we are still in the midst of a global pandemic. The other reality is that what we thought of as normal before the pandemic was broken in many ways. And if we continue to barrel toward it with a singular focus, a transformative future will be foreclosed to us all. Does anybody, have you guys, has that crossed any of your minds? I think about it nonstop. Because many of us are avoiding this opportunity to renovate that which needs to be completely changed and remade. M. Craig Barnes wrote a book called When God Interrupts. And he said this in a book. He said, the deep fear lying behind every loss is that we've been abandoned by the God who should have saved us. The transforming moment comes when we realize that even God has left us. We then discover it was not God, but our image of God that abandoned us. So then, in a sense, this transformative moment for the nation of Israel from the book of Numbers and for us is to allow God to plunge us all into a truly transformative moment. A moment that transforms our relationships with one another and completely transforms the way we see God in these moments of desperation, such as this pandemic. I'm getting a little hot up here. Pastor Mark, can you grab me a box of Kleenex or something? Yeah, and that drink will help too. When I was 21, I graduated from college and wanted to go into ministry. And so I made a decision to move to Canada with my wife, Ruthie. And I did that primarily because my wife is white and I was black, and trying to find a ministry position for a church, that was going to be tough. Not a lot of churches hired black people that were married to white people. But we made the move to Canada. But one of the things I had always dreamed about and talked about, thought about, and schemed about with 3 or 4 high school friends was to plant a new kind of church. A church that wasn't like our parents' church. faithful to teach the scriptures, but focused on meeting the needs of people who didn't really go to church. So while I was living in Canada with my wife Ruthie and our first little boy, who's not a little boy anymore, but an old man, Josiah, my friends started that church. And they started it in an area that was exploding in growth in the western suburbs of Chicago. And it wasn't long before I had the opportunity to leave a really great ministry in Canada and return home and join that new church work in Chicagoland. We doubled in size in 2 years. We went from 300 to 600 people. People were coming to us and they were saying, "How are you guys doing this?" And we were attracting great people to the church, but something was wrong. Not just with the church, but more importantly, I wasn't handling the stress particularly well. Remember I told you we doubled in size? Well, I programmed all aspects of the worship services. The music, the drama, the vocalists, the stage and set design. It was done with incredibly talented, incredibly passionate people. The church was growing, but I didn't handle it well, and subsequently, I was asked to leave or given the opportunity to resign from the staff. My best friends from high school, college, afterwards. We all stood in one another's weddings. I didn't handle any of it very well. In the subsequent years, there was evidence of a much deeper things in my life that I had never dealt with. They were crushing me. What you could see above my waterline, so to speak, belied what was much deeper and not recognized, kind of the tip of the iceberg, you know what I mean? And later on, I had a new realization on my own. 20 years I had been living as a Christian, and I'd been in ministry for over 20 years, and I was tired. I was unhappy. I was frustrated. I was overworked. I had this dream, this vision, what God was going to do, but where was the joy? You know, Jesus talks about this in Mark's gospel, Mark chapter 8, verse 36, where Jesus says, "What does it profit a person, a man, to gain the whole world and lose their soul?" I was stressed, I was hurried, I was exhausted, I was dying to all of the wrong things. And so, several years ago, I took a 3-day course, a graduate course, while on the staff of another church in Chicagoland, totally different church, called Shaping the Heart of a Leader. It was great. We had an opportunity to read assignments that were written by Reggie McNeil and the late Dallas Willard and Pete Scazzaro. And I quickly discovered that the vast majority of us, our lives need to be dramatically changed, but most of us remain too busy or in denial. I knew life at the church where I was serving on that staff needed to change because our relationships with Christ, our relationships with one another were at stake, and they were deeply dysfunctional. Unfortunately, it all came to a head about 8 years ago this fall. It exposed deep, painful, profound fissures in all of our lives. And I arrived at a place where I wasn't so sure of what was ahead, but I knew I wasn't going back. I wasn't going back to Egypt. That wasn't a viable choice. Here's my point. You would have to be intentionally blind to ignore what this pandemic has exposed. In all of our lives. I mean, all of our lives. And while I'm here talking about the folly of wanting to go back to normal or go back to Egypt, Just talk to somebody in the service industry about normal. People who work at grocery stores or restaurants or fast food places or baristas. They don't want to go back to that. They don't want to go back to normal. They were and in many ways still are being treated horribly. And if you are among those of us this past year has exposed deep fissures in your marriage, in your relationships with other people, let me encourage you to reach out to me. I've been and will continue to lead what's called the Emotionally Healthy Relationships course. It's an excellent opportunity for you to begin the work of establishing a new normal, the renovation of relationships that you have. Additionally, if this is where you are, we want to help you make connections with family and marriage therapists and counselors so you can begin the healing and the restorative work your relationships call for. So there's another way, though. There's another way to look at this transformative moment, this opportunity for us to do life in an entirely new way, to renovate our world. And we get a helpful glimpse of this from the book of Acts. Acts chapter 8, 1 through 3. Because there are some folks that make the decision, we ain't never going back to Jerusalem. We're not going back to Jerusalem. That's not an option. In reading through the first few chapters of the book of Acts, it becomes very clear that something spectacular is happening in Jerusalem. Jesus has been slain, buried, resurrected, and ascended. And the promised Holy Spirit has come in a powerful way. It's given birth to the kingdom of God on earth called the church. Explosive numerical growth, manifestations of miraculous healings, public recognition that there is this distinctive people who seem to care deeply for one another. However, this thing called the church, it's also called, you may look in the Bible and you see the phrase the way. It shows up in several places in the book of Acts. But it manages to draw the negative attention of religious leaders there in Jerusalem, seemingly led by a man named Saul. Again, I want you to read this with me. Acts chapter 8, verses 1 through 3. And Saul approved of their killing him. On that day, a great persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. Godly men buried Stephen and mourned deeply for him. But Saul began to destroy the church, going from house to house. He dragged off both men and women and put them in prison. And what really stands out to me in this passage is that the death of a man named Stephen in the last few verses of chapter 7, it's a very thing that leads to the subsequent scattering of the way or the church throughout Judea and Samaria, which, interestingly, are the exact words that Jesus said in Acts chapter 1, verse 8. Do you remember? Jesus said, "And you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth." You know, I've often read this passage and I've wondered if this scattering of the church hadn't occurred like we read about here, when would the world have ever really heard the good news of Jesus? I just thought about that. And what I find interesting is despite the extremely painful, to the point of beatings, jailing, loss of property, life loss, disruption, those who are part of the way, those who are part of the church, are not seen through the pages of the book of Acts or throughout the New Testament saying things like, I can't wait for things to get back to normal. Instead, they lean into this opportunity, and they're scattered across the world, fulfilling Jesus' command from Matthew chapter 28, verse 19. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. Again, from this really great book, When God Interrupts, in a chapter called A Place You'd Rather Not Go, Barnes writes this. He says, conversion always occurs en route to places we do not wish to go. We can only get there when we have abandoned hope of returning to the place we'd rather be. I'll be honest with you, too. At this point in writing this sermon, I got lost completely. I didn't know what else to say. I didn't know what I could say that would really make a difference. I just know that the church is called to be different, to be counter to the culture. And if there ever was a moment for us to be authentically countercultural, it's now. Don't do it. Don't act like you did before. This is a time to reset, reframe, rethink all the things that you sensed, you wondered if they just might not be healthy, not good, not right. One of my favorite authors is a man named Philip Yancey. And he wrote a book about 10 years ago called What Good Is God? And this is what he said in the book from 10 years ago. A time of deep crisis presents an opening for Christians to convey our contrarian message by exposing the lies and shallowness of the big screen. You may remember that for a brief time after September 11th, 2001, which, can you believe, in just a few weeks it'll be 20 years since 9/11. He said all sporting events, comedy shows, and commercials disappeared. That sounds vaguely familiar too. He said they disappeared from television. The huge industry that entertains us and tempts us to indulge in material things had to confront its own irrelevance in the face of national tragedy. People back then spontaneously turned to the church for comfort and for answers. The next few weeks, he writes, church attendance went up 25% until the industries cranked it up again and reclaimed our attention, or as I like to say, things went back to normal. He closes with this, even more important. A time of crisis offers the church the opportunity to present an alternative vision. Jesus exhorted his followers to demonstrate a different way of living and contrary to the culture around them. This can be our reconnecting, renovation moment. That's what this can be. Everything from the inside out, remade, recast, redirected. Not back to Egypt, not back to Jerusalem, but forward into the future, unlike anything we've ever experienced before. Pastor Peter asked me to write this message a long time ago. You know Pastor Peter, he plans everything. So he had me write this talk about writing this message. And the last few weeks I really struggled, like I told you. over the course of the last 13 plus months, the number of times I've heard the particular phrase, marriages are struggling, multiple times in a week. Friends, I've heard that phrase multiple times in a day. As I thought about that and prepared this message, thinking about renovation, rebuilding, I found myself in the days leading up to this thinking about this phrase, marriages are struggling, while I was trying to sleep. 11, 12 o'clock at night, I'm just thinking about marriages are struggling. Thinking about what it might mean if so many of us go back to normal marriages. And frankly, that disturbs me at a level that I can't put into words. So here's what I want to do. I want to invite anyone who senses that going back to your normal marriage is not what you want. So today, 5 p.m. sharp, on the back patio, and I know we've got other stuff going on. I got the okay from Pastor Jonathan on this. 5 o'clock sharp, back patio. You have to wear a mask, even though it's outside. Due diligence. I just want to pray with anyone who doesn't want to do marriage like normal. Pastor Jonathan asked me, well, what's your plan after that? I don't know. But I know that going back to normal in marriages, after what many of us have been through over the last 13 months, that's not a good option. Let's ask God to begin to renovate marriages here at our church. If you can't come, that's okay. If you can't come, that's okay. You can send me an email. And at 5 o'clock, just say you'll be able to pray. Just take some time to pray. But I want to pray with anyone who wants to, that wants to see some change, need a change in their marriage. Okay? Is that all right? And I want to add something. Maybe you're thinking, you know what? We did really well over the last 13 months. Then we need you there too at 5. Because you're an encouragement then to some others maybe it's been tough. That was just thrown in at the last minute. Sorry about that. We're going to sing a song this morning. You may be familiar with the melody, but the words have been changed a little bit. The words of this version of the song communicate hope in place of hopelessness, abundance in place of scarcity, and beauty in the place of ashes. Nay, I'm looking forward to you leading us in this song. We're going to prepare for offering, both online with instructions from our sister, Heather Otieno, and here in person as well. We're going to invite you to prepare your offering that on your way out, you can just drop in the offering box at the back. But I'm going to ask us all to stand. Let's all stand. Let's sing this song together this morning.